Livestock are inherently selective in the way that they graze, and so left to their own devices, they won't necessarily evenly utilize any pasture or landscape that they're grazing upon. And so one of the goals of grazing management is to better distribute livestock across the lands that they're using. The ultimate benefit is sort of twofold. One is that it expands their use within any one given pasture so that you're getting maximum use in terms of forage utilization. But then it also reduces some of the negative impacts that might otherwise persist in areas where they tend to congregate or loaf. And so the land is benefiting as well by increased grazing management. Fundamentally, a ranch is measured in its production of livestock, and so if you're able to distribute grazing more widely across the ranch that you manage, presumably you're able to add more animals to the same amount of ground. With more delicate and more thoughtful grazing management, you're in theory able to allow the animals to graze in places and get better feed value out of the areas that they're grazing. So you're seeing an increase in individual animal performance. Bottom line, you have the potential to add to your bottom line, which is the economic profitability of the ranch that you're managing.
The cattle want to go where the better feed is, and they want to stay away from the areas that doesn't have as good a feed. But one of the challenges is that feed will get better where the cattle will graze. And so if you want to improve areas of your pasture that where the feed isn't as good, you need to get your cattle to be there maybe a little bit more. And if you want to better improve the areas where feed is good, sometimes you got to keep your cattle off of there a little bit more. So affecting the behavior of the cattle is a big challenge in affecting grazing management.
So I started with Cooperative Extension in 2017, and when I moved to Ventura County and started reaching out to livestock producers, Mike Williams was one of the friendliest and most accommodating producers that I had met early in the early weeks of my career. And I went out on a ranch tour with him, as I did with many others, and we got to talking about some of the questions and practices that he had employed on his ranch and the things that he was thinking about. And we hit upon a mutual interest in this idea of stockmanship and herding. And in particular, we were both familiar with the work of a gentleman by the name of Steve Cody.
And in that book, he discusses how adjusting the way that you approach stockmanship or changing the way that you handle your cattle, you can effectively place cattle in areas of your ranch and have them stay there. It occurred to me that by keeping your cattle together in a herd, even regardless of fences, and being able to move them cattle about the pasture, would not only you could affect your distribution of your grazing and increase the quality of your pasture, but it would also affect a whole ton of other factors that are concerns in managing cattle, including your reproduction. Your cows are all in one place, and your bulls would all be in the same place, and you wouldn't have 3 cows over in a draw coming into season where a bull would never even come across them. So you could see your calving season would tighten up. Your overall health and well-being, you'd be able to spot sicknesses much more quickly and more easily and more readily, because all your cattle would be in the same place. A lot of things in my mind that were management concerns would be addressed if this was a way of controlling your cattle. My question at the time was, I think the book had been written in the 90s. My question was, is this too good to be true? Why did I happen to stumble across this in a book instead of watch my neighbor do it and learn from him?
In the days that followed my ranch visit, I got to thinking about how we might be able to formalize some of these questions around stockmanship and herding into an actual research project. Right around that time, coincidentally, was a deadline for a grant, a research and extension grant that was supported by Western SARE. And so Mike and I applied and received the Farmer and Rancher grant that Western SARE offers. The project that we ultimately landed upon within the Western SARE grant had a couple of different components. The most substantial of which was this idea of putting GPS collars on cattle over a certain number of years and applying a herding or stockmanship treatment, if you will, and being able to measure differences in cattle behavior and cattle placement on the landscape between no herding and with herding. We also looked at a couple of other different metrics like cattle fecal pats, if you can believe it. So Mike and I spent a number of days throughout the last couple of years out there counting cow poop. But fundamentally our question was, how practical is it really for a commercial production rancher to apply some of these practices? And how effective is that rancher when he does apply the practices? So on the practical end, we had Mike's personal experience. He also was able to keep a rather impressive and detailed log of the time that he spent throughout the project, both in what ended up being the control year, which was when there was no herding treatment, but then also in the 2 subsequent years when there was a herding treatment. So we have a really detailed account both of the activities that he was engaged in, but also how long it took. So we're able to compare and contrast against sort of the time investment that was required in some of these practices. And then in terms of on the efficiency front, we used the data that was collected from these GPS collars with pretty great precision. We had GPS locations for up to 12 cows throughout 3 years, every 15 minutes, totaling sort of an overwhelming 700,000 data points that exist on some Excel spreadsheets on my computer currently. But able to then run some analyses that allow us to understand, Mike's been putting in this effort, how effective has the effort really been? In green are data points that represent GPS collar locations of cattle during year 2, which was the first year of the herding treatment. So this was the first full year that Mike went out on horseback and attempted to apply many of the principles that he learned from the stockmanship training that he benefited from. You can see some wider use in the western and more mountainous portions of the ranch. And then in yellow, data points from year 3 to give you a sense again of what the data really looks like once we're pulling it off these collars. Now that ultimately there has been a number of ways that we can kind of slice this information, but one kind of interesting and instructive way that we're able to look at it is by actually looking at individual herding events. So I've selected this from one of the many times that Mike went out over the course of a number of days and actually applied a herding treatment. This happened to be in sort of mid-November 2019. And what you're looking at are sort of the northern and western portions of the ranch over 10 days. And I'll run through some slides to give you a sense of kind of what Mike was up to and what the GPS collar data was saying about it. So this is Friday afternoon. He arrived and herded a subset of cows, which are represented in those as those yellow points, and they were dispersed throughout the valley there in 7 small groups when he arrived, and he herded them to a draw towards the south, roughly delineated by that red dot. On Sunday, this is 2 days after Mike placed those cows in that draw by that red dot, and surprising to see that they've drifted some, but they're staying in a pretty tight group. So those yellow points represent all cattle collar data from that day, 11/10. This is Tuesday, and when Mike got there, the cows from a couple of days before and the cows that he had moved the day previous had dispersed throughout that valley, and Mike picked them all up and herded them to that red dot, which represents a water trough on the eastern portion of the ranch there, and he placed them there that afternoon. This is the next day. They did a decent job of staying near the water trough, but Mike actually let them water there and then drove them south back to that draw where there was also some water, and that yellow arrow represents the herding treatment that finished up that day. This is the next day, Thursday, and that part of the group that Mike placed in that southern draw, which is represented in the yellow circle, stayed where Mike had placed them, but about half had drifted down the valley to a different location as represented by that red circle, and you can see in between some yellow dots representing that drift on their way to that red circle. This is the next day, Friday. No herding treatment that day and some drift down the canyon from both groups. Saturday, some further drift north into the hills. And then Sunday, again, no herding and increased drift up into the hills. But a couple things jump out to me. The first is that there was some success in having the cows stay for some amount of days after the herding treatment where they were placed. This was the first year that Mike was attempting the herding treatment, and so obviously, some of the skills haven't been entirely honed. But here, to me also there's some compactness, and so maybe these cows aren't initially where Mike placed them, but they are in general in a fairly tight group, or at least a tighter group than they could be, and so some success there as well. Year one control, 346 hours, and year two, as he was learning the herding treatments, was elevated hours, but not to the extent that we were expecting. And the number of hours spent on ranch working cows in year three actually dropped below year one levels.
I wasn't able to achieve the control early on that I expected, or that I anticipated I might. What I found is that by changing my behavior, it's kind of like learning to ride a horse, or if you're already riding, learning to ride better. Adjusting some of your behaviors to get better performance, but the progress is slow. I'd say at the end of the first year of treatment, or in that process, I was pretty discouraged. Fortunate that I had committed to that second year, because that's when I really started seeing a difference. I still wasn't able to achieve the level of control that I'd initially imagined. But I was able to achieve a greater amount of control than I had thought I would be able to the year before. How I approached cattle and how I moved them. Exercising the control took a longer period of time to analyze and understand the approach, and not only what I needed to do, but what I was doing that was getting the negative effects. You see, one of the things that I run into pretty constantly early on was I'd go out there to do a job, and it's a job that I'd done before, and I knew how to get it done the way I would normally do it, by forcing the cattle to do what I wanted. I'd start trying to do it in a different way, a way I was a little less accustomed to, that I'd learned in the school or the different things, and I'd start running into things wouldn't be working. And my strongest tendency was to revert back, instead of continuing to do the way I was trying to learn to do until I got the behavior that I was looking for. It was revert back in the way I had been doing it for so many years, and then forcing it in, and then I'd lose the progress that I'd made up to that point. Several of the challenges that became really apparent in my case was one of the early ones was terrain. And when I first started working my cattle, I had some guys come out and help teach me and show me some of these principles and help me understand this. And I went to a class and learned some things. I went to a Steve Cody class, and which was very good and very helpful. And I took my cattle and I started working them in some of the flatter areas of my ranch, and got fairly confident and fairly comfortable that I had them working pretty good. There were some that weren't so good, but most of them I had a pretty good handle on. And then I get feeling pretty good, and then we move up into some of the more rugged areas of the ranch, and everything just went to hell. Learning how to cope with those kind of situations without you get up in that rough country and them cattle start getting a lot of different places, and then you can almost wear your horse out trying to put them things back together all the time. And so that's one of the issues that I run into was terrain affects that to a certain amount of degree, particularly cattle that have been living in that country for years. But when you put all your cattle in a certain area, some of the areas would probably have enough during the winter time, but the summertime it's not enough. And the dynamics of the ranch it'd be really beneficial to be able to put cattle in this area in the summertime, and as the drought season hit for that year, and I wasn't able to do that at least effectively because of water. And so on a couple of years that we did this were drought years. One particularly, I had to split them herds up just because I didn't have enough water in certain areas that I needed water for the time of year I needed to put cattle in to handle all the cattle. So water, you limit when you start doing this. You can minimize your need for fencing infrastructure, but you increase your need for water infrastructure, at least enough water to handle a large number of cattle. So that was another obstacle that I run into. Another thing is I had the best conception rates I've ever had, and again, a lot of factors could have been due to a lot of factors, but I have no doubt that how the cattle were being handled affected that. I doctored less cattle this year than I ever have. I think I had to doctor 3 calves all year. Working my cattle in the corrals and in the chute was it's hard to quantify, but it was immense, the difference of working cattle that have been handled different. And it's they're not dull when you're trying to sort. They're not too dull to sort, but they're not crazy. It's the system and the flow of working cattle in the corrals is way better than it has been in the past. And if you add in the facts of the time it used to take for me to drive around that ranch when they were spread out all over 12,000 acres, and I'd spend half a day or more driving around looking at cattle, and I might see a third of the herd on any given day. Now I can go out there and see nearly every cow I got within it, even when there's in different herds in a very short period of time. So the amount of time I have to do in just checking cattle and keeping track of them is greatly reduced. I think that employing these principles and these techniques is something that should be incorporated in every ranch to whatever degree they want to do it. Whether you try to go and affect their placement on 2 or 3 times a week, or whether you just incorporate these principles when you gather them off the the summer pasture, and when they're in the corrals, the improvements that they have in the cattle that you can achieve in your cattle over time will pay off in their health, in their gains, in their weight gains, and in your overall experiences. Manage your expectations. The key is the more time that you put into it, the faster these changes will happen. If you're only seeing your cows once a year, there's going to be a process. It's going to take more years before you're going to see behavior changes in your cows. If you see them more commonly, and if you incorporate these principles more often in your interactions with them, those changes will happen faster. Again, it's in the interactions and making sure that your cattle learn. Your cattle are going to learn every interaction they have with you, and depending on how that experience is whether you make progress towards a more positive experience for the animal, or whether you set yourself backwards. And so the more often you can have positive experiences, because there's going to be negative experiences, you're going to have bad days, and so you just got to have enough good days to offset the bad days.